citizen.
Out of many
We are world citizens, same vision is for equal rights and justice for the people them. What's happening to this beautiful world that we're living in? World citizen, lift up your voices.
Welcome to another episode of the People Powered Planet podcast, where each week we bring you extraordinary solution areas with key solutions to the problems plaguing our planet. The internet is filled with sites and videos about all the terrible problems of the world. But this program specifically wants to bring the key cutting-edge solutions that can really make a difference to save this gorgeous, beautiful planet of ours. And today we have an extremely special guest, and it's Alyn Ware, who is the policy director for the World Federalist Movement and the Institute for Global Policy. And these key organizations are really both doing the research side and the implementation side of an incredible plan to help keep planet Earth together. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Alyn. Alyn started off as a young man wanting to be a physicist. He was brilliant and loved science until he realized that that's taking us into a path of nuclear war, and that was terminating society. So instead, he became a kindergarten teacher. Well, as a kindergarten teacher, he began to teach kids conflict resolution, and he developed a peace education curriculum that became a key part of all the New Zealand schools. And he ended up getting schools to be declared nuclear free. And then he went from there to getting all of New Zealand declared nuclear free. And if that wasn't enough, he went on to get the entire Pacific area declared a nuclear free zone. And then what's the next step? The world. So he was very active in a campaign to actually, he was the World Court Project UN coordinator that achieved the historic ruling from the World Court about the illegality of nuclear weapons. They've actually been declared by the World Court to be illegal. Well, if that wasn't enough, he went on to begin to implement the efforts of the World Court by working with people in the UN to draft the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I saw during the negotiations on putting this together, I saw him speaking at the UN. You can watch this online, talking about how one of the key levers is the financial one, that, it's only 27 companies that make these bombs, yet they're the ones lobbying for all this money, and that he wanted to prohibit also not only the making, manufacturing or anything, but actually the financing of nuclear weapons. But the UN people say, oh, that's covered by aiding and abetting, so that's taken care of. But anyway, he became the engaged parliamentarians around the world, all the different congressmen, representatives, members of parliament around the world, to work with parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. So he's had an extraordinary hero's journey, and it's continuing. And you can be part of this continuing journey as he works for the abolition of nuclear weapons, but actually, in the long term, the abolition of war. So welcome, Alyn. Did I capture your story?
Well, thank you very much, Arthur. Although it does sound a bit like a single person doing all that, all of those things took cooperation with organizations, people. It's a team effort that we're doing to prohibit war, end war, and achieve peace. But yes, I have been involved in all of those, and it's been exciting, and also to see the connections between some of these different aspects of peace and disarmament.
So tell us a little bit more about some of the steps in that journey. So, you wanted to be a physicist, but you became a kindergarten teacher. Tell us how all that evolved.
Yeah, actually in primary school, I was enthralled with the whole atomic nature of matter. My family had been involved in some of that work. One of my uncles had worked for Ernest Rutherford, who was the first scientist to split the atom. Of course, it was Einstein was the one who came up with the formula E=mc², which is the amount of energy that could be released if you're splitting masses of atoms, which is what a nuclear bomb is and what nuclear energy is. But the science of it was really intriguing to me until I started finding out what was happening with these nuclear weapons. And I come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the Pacific. This is where the nuclear weapon states had been testing their nuclear weapons by detonating them. And this had been creating a horrific radiation that had been spreading around and having huge problems with health, with deformed babies, with stillbirths, with cancers. And so I started saying, hold it, these are horrible. In peacetime, what might happen if they're used in war? It would be even worse. So that's when I flipped and go, oh, I have to move away from just, hey, science is wonderful by itself, to science has to be used in a positive way. We need education to be able to deal with these issues. So yeah, that's why I then switched into peace education.
So tell me about your journey in peace education and how you ended up going from that to developing a program for all the New Zealand schools.
So for me, the nuclear weapons are like the tip of the iceberg. Why is it that countries are relying on these weapons? It's because a number of reasons, but one of them is that they're not able to resolve their international conflicts peacefully. They still hold on to the notion that they can have their security or protect themselves through threatening someone else. And to me, that's not a conflict resolution approach. That's not going to resolve these issues. That's just going to lead to more wars, into nuclear war. So how do you address that? We have to start thinking about how do we resolve conflicts better? And that's part of education and training. And the best way to start on that is to start with youth, with young people, and get them trying out, conflict resolution in their own homes, in the schools, and seeing that it can work, that they can resolve these conflicts with either their brothers and sisters or their parents, other peers in the classroom. And when they see that they can resolve these conflicts peacefully, they then get more ideas about how it's possible to solve these conflicts internationally. And that gives hope that it's possible to have a peaceful world without relying on threats to blow the world up and to blow each other up. So to me, these went hand in hand, the peace education and trying to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. And that's why in New Zealand, when we started the campaign to make New Zealand nuclear free, we were dealing at the political level, working with the parliamentarians, working with the government, at the public level through the media, but also in education, in schools, but also in community education. And it was all a part of what was a successful campaign that shifted the thinking in New Zealand. Earlier on, most New Zealanders had supported nuclear weapons. From when the nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we were in the Pacific. Japan had already taken over a lot of the islands in South Asia. They're taking over a lot of the Pacific islands. They're about to come and attack New Zealand. So most New Zealanders at that time, back in 1945, celebrated the nuclear weapons and felt, hey, they saved us. And that thinking continued quite some time. We joined a nuclear alliance. It was called ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Most New Zealanders for quite some time thought, we need these nuclear weapons for protection. So we realized it's not just good enough to go and protest and say the nuclear weapons are bad. If people think they need them for the protection, you have to educate people that there are better ways to have security than the threat of nuclear weapons. Now, part of that was not just how you resolve conflicts internationally, but how there are mechanisms of governance, which is really important. We elevated the United Nations to say, look, if there's ideas for resolving the conflicts, here's a place where it can happen. We can meet with these countries. You can take issues to either the General Assembly or the Security Council or the International Court of Justice. This was a really important part of the education, that there are mechanisms at the international level to help countries resolve conflicts peacefully. So New Zealand got really engaged in the United Nations, and we basically switched from reliance on our allies, which was primarily the United States and Australia, and reliance on military things of security, to relying on common security and the United Nations.
Fascinating, because very often it looks to me like the countries in the world act like schoolyard bullies with no better idea how to resolve conflict. Somehow I'll bully you and you'll submit, and that'll solve it. And that didn't work, so I'll bully you more. Well, that didn't work, so let's get some other bullies to join with us, and we'll really bully you bad. And both sides are doing that, and they seem to be almost infantile in their inability to move beyond that to the more effective means that even kids are learning on the playground of better ways to resolving conflict than just straightforward bullying. So how do we begin to both educate leaders, or how do we begin to move the world toward more effective means of conflict resolution?
Well, I actually think it's really important to give examples of success stories, because that's help you build confidence that this can work. And I think it's more than just one bully versus another bully. In the international world, we have some big bullies, more powerful, and some smaller countries that, if there's not some way of resolving the conflicts peacefully through international mechanisms, the smaller countries will just go, the only way we can provide for our security is to latch ourselves onto one of the big countries. And that's sort of the idea of, these alliances, the military alliances. New Zealand, a small country, we go, how do we protect ourselves? We have to be part of the bigger country. We have to have the big bully on our side, United States, in order to protect us against the other big bully, which back then was the Soviet Union. We need to replace that with other ways of dealing with those issues. And what we found in New Zealand is we could actually try some different ways of dealing with these issues, and it would work. So, for example, the nuclear tests in the Pacific. These were the powerful countries. France, the UK, the United States were the ones that were detonating their nuclear weapons. For us in the Pacific, this was horrible, the destruction it was doing. But if we just tried to oppose this, the big countries weren't really listening. So we turned to the United Nations, and that gave us a much better approach. Rather than just latching on and switching over to the other bully, like the Soviet Union, which wouldn't have worked, we go, let's try the United Nations. So, for example, we took a case to the International Court of Justice against France, on the testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific, 1974. And what happened? The next year, France stopped their atmospheric testing. They were sort of reluctant to.
There was a court ruling against their testing, is that right?
Yeah, and the France then stopped. In 1975, it was against atmospheric testing. France then went underground and only did underground testing. So we went back to the court later against the underground testing, and that's worked as well. France then stopped the underground testing and closed down the test site. So this is an example. This is how I got interested in international law. I go, wow, look at the impact that this case had in the International Court of Justice had on an issue that was so important to us when we were a small country and a bigger country was doing something horrible, and we could actually have an impact by going to the International Court of Justice. That's a positive example. And there are so many other examples of cases in the International Court of Justice where this has worked. And that's why we've launched this campaign, which we'll probably talk a bit about later, called Law Not War, Legal Alternatives to War. There are legal alternatives, and the International Court of Justice is one of the best, but it's not the only one. There are other mechanisms as well. And we had another example, again with the French. Before they finished their underground testing, they blew up one of our peace boats, the Rainbow Warrior, in our harbour. This was 1985, and we caught two of their agents who had done it, and they were convicted because one of our crew members got killed, so it was manslaughter. When we convicted their agents, France put a boycott on New Zealand products throughout the whole European Union, so we couldn't export any of our products to the European Union. It was like the bully. France was being the big bully, So we went to the United Nations again, but this time we didn't go to the court. We went to the special office of the UN Secretary General to ask for mediation between France and New Zealand. And it worked. We managed to mediate an agreement with France, thanks to the Secretary General's office of the United Nations, where France admitted they'd done wrong. They paid compensation to Greenpeace, whose boat it was, to the family if Fernando was killed, to New Zealand. And we released their agents to go back to France. So we have these are two examples from my country. And once I, saw that, hey, these things can work, I started exploring what are some of the other court cases and the impact they had, and seeing time after time after time, these court cases under the International Court of Justice or the mediations that are run by the UN are successful. and are helping to resolve these international conflicts. The problem is we don't hear about them in the media. We hear in the media all the problems, when countries go into conflict, when they fight, when they have wars, when they threaten each other with nuclear weapons. So it gives sort of a bad sense, an incorrect idea that, oh, humanity is just horrible. We're just fighting each other all the time. We need to have more of these stories of these conflicts being resolved. Libya and Chad had wars before they took the case to the International Court of Justice. The Central American peace accords, which Oscar Arias negotiated back in the late 1980s, he was able to do that because of the Nicaragua versus United States case in the International Court of Justice. There are many examples of success stories, and we need to hear more of these success stories. That will give people more confidence that it is possible to resolve these international conflicts peacefully when we use these mechanisms, when we use the International Court of Justice, when we use the mediation service. Too often countries don't, because people don't push them to do it.
Well, you're so right that stories are key to moving us in society, and I'm so glad you brought up that example in Central America, because when Costa Rica was surrounded by hostile military powers threatening to destroy it, President Arias had this brilliant solution. He got rid of his military. Well, but he didn't have any military. There was nothing to attack, so nobody attacked him. He was safe. Well, then there was one incursion, one dispute where another power was coming after him, but he took it to that court, as you mentioned, and it was resolved in the court, and all the nations of Latin America supported it, and so he won. He didn't have to go to war. He didn't have to go lobbing missiles and shooting. And there is a wonderful documentary called A Bold Peace that shows that, and I highly recommend it. And it's an example of one of those stories. And of course, we had all the stories of the nations throughout Eastern Europe facing tanks coming rolling into their countries from Russia, and they used nonviolent resistance, and they won. And of course, in Ukraine, we see the disastrous failure of when you try to use military solutions instead, and you get half your country blown up. I mean, I know when I went to Lithuania, I met with the first head of state, Landsbergis, who had led the singing revolution. And there, they mourn the loss of 14 people in their revolution that gave them independence from the Soviet Union. The Soviet tanks came rolling in, and every time the tank the people would block the tanks coming in. It was singing revolutions, and they had people holding hands across the whole from Lithuania through the whole Balkan states. And they had an incredibly powerful nonviolent revolution, but the media didn't cover it. The world doesn't know about it because if it leads, it bleeds, and this wasn't bleeding. So, oh well, there was going to be a conflict, but nothing happened. And I think part of the tragedy is that we're not getting out these incredible nonviolent stories that show there's greater power in nonviolence than in tanks and bombs. So I'm very glad you put your finger on stories. That's of course the key to why did the World Is My Country Gary Davis story and other key stories in media to move this. And I see a number of people here that also work in the storytelling field, people like Suzanne and others here. Now, I also noticed in the chat, you talked about law, not war, and that's the key to what the World Federalist Movement is about. But someone asked in the chat, there's something about Federalists, and they've seen that associated with some right-wing group, and Rebecca pointed out that was a semantic overlap. Tell us a little bit more about the World Federalist Movement, and what does that mean, the World Federalist Movement?
Yeah, first, let me say just a little bit more about nonviolent resistance and nonviolence in general, and then where this dovetails nicely into legal mechanisms and law, not war. They're not one and the same. So nonviolence works at many different levels. And the idea of it is that you're responding to human rights violations, autocratic governments, maybe aggression, a number of different things through nonviolent techniques. And there are a whole range of different ways of doing that. Gene Sharp has put out a wonderful manual of 198 different types of nonviolent action. And it's useful to have a look at those because different types of non-violent strategies will be more appropriate to different situations. The thing is, though, that you can't say that non-violence works all the time. Non-violence does rely on the capacity to reach the adversary, to be able to demonstrate to the adversary that you're not threatening them, so it's worth to actually sit down and discuss, try and work something out. But the adversary is not always reachable. And that's where when non-violence is not possible, you need really strong law and global governance to address those issues, particularly acts of aggression. So, for example, during Soviet Union times, there were some times when non-violence sort of seemed to work okay, but other times when it didn't, where there was not a willing partner on the other side to actually entertain. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is one example where non-violence wasn't able to work. In the beginning, there were Ukrainians who tried to sort of talk to the Russian soldiers coming in. They tried to say, turn your tanks around, Moscow's back that way. They tried to talk with their friends in Russia, saying, look, we're not threatening Russia. But it didn't work. The Russian onslaught came in, it turned military. In that case, international law has to swing in order to try and put a stop on the aggressive actions and also build an individual responsibility to those who are undertaking crimes of aggression, war crimes, etc. So this is where I see there's a complementarity between non-violent approaches, and some of those are working at the international level. Mediation, for example, negotiation and non-violent approaches. But you also need to have the capacity to be able to take stronger legal actions when the mediation, negotiation, non-violence doesn't work. That's why these cases in the International Court of Justice on genocide is so important. Because when you have these, so you've got the Ukraine versus Russia, you've got the Gambia versus Myanmar, and we've now got South Africa versus Israel. Because here we seem to have aggressive powers that are not able to be reached and stopped, through non-violent techniques. And so that's why we really need, the law and a stronger law for this. And the Law Not War campaign, legal alternatives to war, is calling for better use of the International Court of Justice, calling for expanding the jurisdiction of the court, because at the moment the jurisdiction is limited through a number of means, through states who have accepted the jurisdiction for all cases, that's 74 countries, or through treaties which specifically include it, like the Genocide Convention. But there's still a lot of conflicts where the court doesn't have jurisdiction, and so isn't able to take this role. So we're trying to say, look, it's really important to strengthen the court. In fact, we should have universal jurisdiction. It seems a little strange that we have international law, but it's up to the countries whether or not they are bound by it. We wouldn't do that in our national countries. In our national countries, everyone has to uphold the law, and if they don't, they can be arrested, taken to court. At the international level, it's like, oh, you can only be taken to court if there's some way that the court can have jurisdiction over it. So part of the campaign is putting out the ideal, which is we want universal jurisdiction. But we know we're not going to get that tomorrow. So in the meantime, we can build up more and more countries accepting jurisdiction, better use of the treaties, like the Genocide Convention, that include jurisdiction of the court for disputes under that treaty, and better use of what's called the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And so one case that I was very involved in, which used the advisory opinion approach, was the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. You mentioned that when you were introducing me. Mm-hmm. That was a really important way of getting the issue of the threat or use of nuclear weapons into the court. The advisory opinion approach is still a real case. It's not just a case of the court is saying, hey, it's giving some advice. No, it's actually what the court is doing is it's giving a determination about what is the state of the law with regards to this particular issue. But the difference between that and a contentious case is an advisory opinion. They're not saying this one country is right and that one country is wrong. What they're saying, this is what the law is. And it's then up to the body that's asking the opinion to implement that decision. So for the nuclear weapons, it was the UN General Assembly which asked the question. So once the court said the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal, and there's an obligation to negotiate for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Then we swung back into the UN General Assembly to do resolutions on the negotiations, etc. In the court right now is a similar type of question on the obligations of states with respect to climate change. And this is so important because we're failing in the Framework Convention, on climate change and the COP process. They're not managing, these processes are not strong enough to limit carbon emissions to the level that's going to keep us under the 1.5 degree increase, which would be devastating. We're getting catastrophic climatic incidents, events from 1.2 degrees increase. If it goes up to 1.5, it'll be even worse. But the trajectory that we're on with the current processes, we're going to go up to 2 degrees greater. That's why we need the International Court of Justice, because it can come in and it can bypass the politics. It can bypass the economic power of the corporations, who are lobbying at the COP meetings, to make sure, we've got to keep the fossil fuel economy going, we'll just manage it. The International Court of Justice, its task is to look at what are the facts and how does the law apply to the facts, and therefore what are the obligations arising from that. And they can't really be lobbied. The judges who are sitting in the court, they don't represent countries. They are there as legal judicial experts. Some of them may err a little towards the country where they've come from, but they can't really be lobbied. You can't put a boycott on the products of a particular country or trade from a particular country that a judge comes from. It's got no impact because that judge has got no responsibility position to a country. The judge is there as a judge. So we have a huge opportunity to be able to bypass the politics, the economic influence of the corporate powers, and really look at what is the science and what is the law applying to that. And so that's what we're trying to educate people about, why these processes in the courts can be so helpful and why we need to elevate this, but also why we need to give more support to the International Court of Justice. It's got so many more cases now than when it was first set up. Its budget is minuscule. It's like, and part of the problem of that is that they've got such a big caseload now that it's taking them a much longer time to be able to address all the cases. So we need to put more resources. At the moment, the world is putting $2.3 trillion a year into weapons in the arms race. And how much goes into the United Nations system? The base amount is 6.5 billion. A small percentage of the amount of money that's going into military. We need to put more money into peace and into effective peace mechanisms, which the UN is a very effective peace mechanism and can help resolve these conflicts rather than so much money and political resources into military approaches. We know they can work, and we've got lots of examples, and we can get engaged in them. We can follow what's happening, with the South Africa versus Israel case. You can watch it online. You can watch the deliberations. You can see all the documents that have been submitted to the court. You can talk to your governments and say, hey, are you involved? Because other governments can participate in these cases. So we have a lot more opportunity for democratic decision-making and support of judicial process than we've ever had in the past. And part of what we're doing with this particular podcast is to help people see that so they can then become more involved. And with Law Not War, we have 80 organizations involved, a lot of individuals. We can help to keep you up to date with what's happening with these judicial processes and how you can be involved and how this can make a difference to build us to a world that is ruled by law, not war. I'd say law and peace, not war.
Well, I think you gave a great example, and maybe you could mention a little more about it, because economics does really play a key role in all this. And people throw out figures; it's hard to recognize what they mean. What was your example of the stack of bills?
So we looked at one part of the military spending, and that is the spending on nuclear weapons. It's about 10% approximately of the global spending on military, but we picked on the nuclear weapons one because it's so obvious that nuclear weapons are bad, and the spending on the nuclear weapons should be the first part that we cut. We should also be cutting the spending on the other weapons, but that's a little more complicated. The nuclear weapons one should be simple. So the amount of money that's spent on nuclear weapons per year is around about 100 billion. We don't know exactly because not all the figures are declared. Some we have to be guessed, but around about 100 to 120 billion dollars a year. So what we did is we looked at how much is that over 10 years? That's $1 trillion. That's quite a lot of money. But how do you imagine that? So we made these notes, and each note is $1 million. It looks a bit like a $1 US note. And we printed 1 million of those. So 1 million times $1 million notes. That's the amount that's spent over 10 years for nuclear weapons. And then we thought, let's see how long it would take us to count it all out. And so we had set up a space in the art area in Manhattan that people can sort of walk into as they're going along looking at other art galleries, and they see us, oh, we're doing something fun. And they can come in and they can help us count out the money. And we spent it doing over a week. And there are a lot of us involved. We were going, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million. And there was lots of us counting, but over a week, we couldn't do it. The amount, we got up to $600 billion, and the room was full of these notes. We were putting them into these different 17 baskets for the Sustainable Development Goals. They were like this high. They got totally filled, huge amount of money. And the very fact of doing it, you realize how much money this is. Like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, that's so much money. So it does show us it's a huge amount. So this was part of the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign. And I see someone did put in the chat the website for it, nuclearweaponsmoney.org. And part of it is educating what that money could be spent on instead. Part of it is moving on cutting the nuclear weapons budgets in the countries that have nuclear weapons. So in the United States, for example, one of our most active proponents of the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign is Senator Ed Markey. And Senator Markey has got a bill, for example, called the SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure. And that is to cut huge amounts of money from the nuclear weapons. He had another one during the COVID time, the ICBM bill. ICBM is Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, but he switched it around to invest in cures before missiles. And basically, if you don't buy any more new intercontinental ballistic missiles, this is all the money that we'd have to put into health. A huge amount. So that's in the US. We also have similar people in our network of parliamentarians doing the same sorts of things in France and in the UK, where there is a public process for the nuclear weapons spending. It's not really possible to do this in China or Russia. There's no public process for that or decision making there. But what we can do that affects the nuclear weapons in those countries as well, and India and Pakistan, is the next part of the campaign, which is nuclear weapons divestment. And that is where we're calling on banks, governments, pension funds, university endowment funds to stop investing in the nuclear weapons corporations. There are about 27 of them. That includes a couple of Russian ones. There is 2 Indian ones, I think. Pakistan, aren't any in China, because China, it's all government run. There's a Dutch one. There's a few others. Of course, a few in the UK. So we've got the list of those up on the nuclearweaponsmoney.org website, and you can make sure that you're not investing. And if you're doing investments, or your bank's not investing in it, or your university's not investing. So that's another way that we're involved. And one of the things we were hoping, but we couldn't get them to agree, was that the states parties negotiating the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons would include in that treaty a prohibition of the financing of nuclear weapons. But they didn't want to do it because they knew that if they did that, they'd get huge problems, with the nuclear weapon states, because that hits them where it hurts. If you're hitting, the money. Some countries have done it. My country, New Zealand, has done it. So our national banks, our pension fund, what's called superannuation fund, and others not allowed to invest in nuclear weapons industry. Switzerland's done it. Norway's done it, and Liechtenstein has done it. So we've got good examples of countries that have stopped investments in nuclear weapons of public funds. I hope the other states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons follow their example and also stop investing public funds, but we can do it ourselves as well.
Yes, we've had Susie Snyder of Don't Bank on the Bomb here, and I think that's so crucial what you're mentioning on the economic handle on it, especially when we realize how few companies are involved and how their lobbyists, you know, they don't play a major part of the economy, but their lobbyists are pretty powerful in really creating an impact that could terminate humanity. Talk a little more about how we can use that economic power. You mentioned you could use that economic is both the cause of nuclear weapons. How can we use the power of economics to save our world from nuclear war?
With the moving the nuclear weapons money campaign, what we're showing is not just stopping the funding for the nuclear weapons, but it opens up opportunities for funding better things. So that's why we didn't call it stop the nuclear weapons money, we call it move the nuclear weapons money. So that's sort of, you know, what Senator Markey, for example, has been doing, is that when he says the sane, smarter approach to nuclear expenditure, this is what we could cut, this is what we could put it into. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is in investments. So it's not just a case now of looking at blacklisting certain parts of investments, like all the nuclear weapons corporations, not including them in your investment portfolio. What we're looking more and more now is what's called ESG, environmental, social, and governance framework for your investments. So look at if you have money to invest, or if your religious group has money to invest, if you're that, or if your university has money to invest, it's better not just to say don't invest in the bad things, but here's how those investments can actually do good. And that's what the ESG framework is. And that's very easy to do now. When we started doing this, it was very hard. It was a lot of hard work to do the investigation of where your investments were going and what the companies were. But now there's so much accountability, and the ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is there's huge management of this. So there's a whole platform in the UN, for example, that financial institutions and corporate institutions sign up to demonstrate that they are following these ESG principles. And also, if you're an investor, there's a whole lot of different sort of ESG packages that you can go for. So it's a lot easier now to make your money do good, as well as ensuring that it doesn't do bad.
Well, I think it's so key that you've got parliamentarians involved in this. And of course, that was one of the key approaches that Gary Davis, who inspired this People Powered Planet podcast, did when he started the World Cities movement. So he said that nations don't really exist. They're lines, invisible lines we've drawn on the planet, but cities do. And municipalities can come together to have terrific power, and I think you're showing that. Maybe you could talk briefly about parliamentarians, and then I know there's lots of other questions. I could ask you questions all day, but I'll open up to other people's questions after you tell us a little bit more about that key lever of using parliamentarians to move the world.
Yeah, so I was asked to establish a network of parliamentarians, asked by Senator Douglas Roach from Canada, who had founded this organization called Parliamentarians for Global Action that had been working on these issues in the late 1980s or early 1990s. Parliamentarians for Global Action, once the Cold War was over, they sort of dropped the program of nuclear disarmament. So it was sort of left languishing. So Senator Roach asked, if I could help set up a new network of parliamentarians, which we've done. We work very closely with Parliamentarians for Global Action. There's a lot of cooperation, but Parliamentarians for Global Action is looking at other issues now. We needed one to look specifically at the nuclear disarmed issue. So that's what PNND is, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. It's cross-party, and although, of course, we have more members from, say, Green parties and social democratic parties than we do from conservative parties, but we still have a range. Like, for example, one of our co-presidents from Japan is from the Liberal Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, and has been the foreign minister of Japan. And then, as I said, Senator Markey is one of our co-presidents from the US. We don't have any Republican members at the moment in the United States. We used to, but that's difficult in the United States. But the thing is with the parliamentarians is that what we do is try and take them out of the normal partisan politics that they find themselves in, in their constituencies and in their national parliaments, and give them a forum where they can talk with parliamentarians from other countries outside of their straitjacket of their political party or their responsibilities, and that gives them more freedom. And so we do that through events that we organise, but also through some of the interparliamentary bodies, such as the Interparliamentary Union, which is 178 parliaments. So we're very engaged with that. Also the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. OSCE is Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's not just Europe. The US and Canada are also part of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. It's a wonderful opportunity when you talk to parliamentarians sort of like outside of this, as I said, the straitjacket of party politics. They can come up with a lot more ideas about cooperation, building, global frameworks, building global governance, play a really important role in some of the global governance initiatives. So Parliamentarians for Global Action, for example, is very much engaged in getting parliamentary support and government support for the International Criminal Court. And World Federalist Movement works very closely with Parliamentarians for Global Action. We still do on the International Criminal Court. Parliamentarians, of course, have played roles in other areas, like in building support for regional nuclear weapon-free zones. So there's many aspects that it's really important of building them. One of the things that for us, though, is that, parliamentarians need to have the also dynamic interaction with their constituents as well. So what we did with PNND is we've made it very public. If someone joins PNND, their name sort of goes up on the website and people can contact them. And they know that, so the ones that join us are quite open. Yeah, we want to have engagement with public, and they don't mind, having their name out. Some are different. Parliamentarians for Global Action doesn't do that because they're working more on sort of behind the scenes parliamentary work. So there's not, I'd say, in engaging with parliamentarians, it's not one shoe fits all. There's not one modality that should fit for everything. There are different processes, and there can be different roles that parliamentarians can play. And sometimes, you really need to have a non-partisan approach. And other times you might want to get a political party to really push something. And so we have that flexibility in PNND to enable that.
Wonderful. Well, what an incredible talk. And, you mentioned that that in one of your other talks that there was actually more being spent on nuclear weapons now than there was at the height of the Cold War. So there's lots for parliamentarians to work with that huge stack of bills. Well, I'm going to turn this over to Melanie Bennett, our producer on the show, who can take questions from our audiences that are local here. And if other people who are tuning in later have questions, they can also text them to us. So anyway, go ahead, Melanie.
Thank you, Arthur. And Alyn, what a plethora of information, what a plethora of ideas, things people can do, how they can participate. And my goodness, it's so exciting. It's so exciting because here's all this good news going on, all these successes. So thank you, Alyn. I am inviting people to sign the, we have a declaration everyone should sign. What it is divesting as well. And you can just go to theworldismycountry.com/endorse. It's very important that we all take action in, like I said, the many ways that you've shown us that we can do so. Thank you so much, Alyn. And we do have, oh, there's Bud right now. Bud, go ahead with your question and your comment.
Sure. First of all, Alyn, thank you for your lifelong commitment and passion and breadth of knowledge and depth of immersion in this challenging time. I wanted to make sure that people that are unaware of the Federalist Society in the United States is light years in the opposite end of the spectrum compared with what you're doing. It was founded in about the 1980s during the Reagan era, and it's ultra right-wing conservative, all in favor of nation-state separation and maintaining executive privilege for the power elite. So that's an important distinction that needs to be made when people hear about the Federalist Movement. And I just wanted, I'm sure you would agree with your assessment of that. And I'm also curious what your takeaway is from the most recent World Economic Forum in Davos. That is probably requires a PhD dissertation to answer that question. But more importantly, I think what concerns me the most is that individual bad actors and individual authoritarian leaders can wreak havoc on any issues that are collectively and collaboratively agreements and the world justice issues and in any moment. And what seems to be missing in most of these conversations is how do we go about transforming the movement now that is supporting authoritarian leaders and nationalism? Because it seems to me it arises from fear and hatred and pathologically unstable individual human beings, witness Trump in our country, and the danger that he represents to anything to do with civility and respect and common decency of kindness, peaceful actions, and love.
I don't have a simple answer to your question because I don't think there is one. To me, this draws back to the huge importance of education, because when you're talking about these authoritarian rulers, and the narratives that they're bringing in, and the fact that people pick up on those narratives, which to me is quite shocking. The number of people, who believe the rubbish that Trump talks about, the number of Russians who believe the rubbish that Putin talks about, because they frame this narrative in the way that I'm standing up for you. Trump does that. I'm standing up for the forgotten American, who's been left out of globalization or human rights or wokeism or whatever. Putin has done the same thing. He's created this enemy image of the West, and he's saying, I'm defending you from the corruption you have from the West, from these corrupt moral standards. If you just saw the most recent one was this party, and he made this out as being the worst thing in the world. These people having this party, and this was the sign of Western moral corruption coming in and destroying the fabric of Russian society. Nothing about how Russia is destroying Ukrainian society with a horrible attacks, and how he's destroyed Russian society through squashing any dissent. But they've captured this narrative, and a lot of people have fed in and accepted that narrative. And we are trying to, I know there's many attempts to bring the counter narratives that are, trying to discount, these false narratives from these autocratic leaders. But that's really, really difficult unless you have a well-educated population that can, shift the wheat from the chaff. You say that can critically think about what they're listening to and analyze it and go, where is this coming from? What does it mean? And reject some of these false narratives. So to me, when I see the societies that don't succumb as much to these horrific narratives, it's the one where they have better education systems, and that the populace is much more critical thinking. And that to me is so important. Now, the problem with that, of course, is if you're only focusing on education, it's a long lag time before, the ones that you're working with, in schools are actually part of the decision making. So I don't think that education should only be about the school based. The education also needs to be in the public realm and with the parliamentarians. Parliamentarians are critical. And by parliament, I should say legislators, not parliamentarians, legislators, because we need to be working with the ones at the city level, the ones at the state level, ones at national level, and then also ones that are working in the regional bodies. The engaging. I think there's a very high value in working with the legislators because they are influencers and they're also decision makers. So if you've got working with enough legislators to counter these narratives, they can make a difference. They can ensure that legal processes and that help. And I see, like in the United States, for example, there are some good aspects to the fact that Trump is actually up for trial in many different places. We don't know how far that's going to go, but the very fact that that's happening in the United States shows that there are some really good processes in the United States that aren't in some of these other autocratic countries. You know, they don't have the same process for Putin, for example, in Russia. Putin's doing horrible illegal things, but there's no possibility for the judicial, process to be able to stop him. But in the United States, there is. So that, to me, there are some really good things, in the United States that help counter some of this. The same in Europe. There's some very good mechanisms in Europe that help counter some of this. So we need to support those and don't just give up, and go, oh, there's nothing we can do, because these powerful figures are manipulating the narratives. There are things that we can do. It may not be possible to stop it or reverse it totally right now, but each little thing counts. And if some of us are working in schools, some of us are working with legislators, some are working to ensure, that we stamp out corruption further, or good accountability processes, in the legal and economic fields, all of these little things are going to help out, even if not one of them can provide the full solution. They all work together. So as an individual, I say, what's the thing that you as an individual feel comfortable working in? Where's the space that you feel comfortable working, and do the best in that space that you can. If you don't really feel comfortable working with legislators, well, don't leave that to someone else, But if you feel really comfortable working in public education, then do that. If you feel really comfortable following the legal mechanisms or checking corruption and demonstrating, the other possibilities, then do that. There are many different ways of doing this. One other thing I might mention, I know there's some more hands, so I won't go long, is I found really, really helpful the Global Peace Index. And I don't know if you know about this, but the Global Peace Index was set up with 23, I think, indicators of the level of peace in a country. And most of these are also very consistent with low levels of corruption, and low levels of despotism and autocracy in countries. High level of peace is very high level of democracy. And it's really good to have a look at them because it breaks it down into like different systems, and it demonstrates where countries are doing really well. So ones that we can learn from and emulate and go, hey, this works in Finland, or it works in New Zealand, or works in Switzerland. The ones that are high up on the list, and you actually see why they're high up on the list, what are the mechanisms they've got in place, and that's something you can then bring in to where they're not working so well in other countries. So I really recommend looking at the Global Peace Index, looking at the indicators. It's a really, really helpful tool to addressing this issue, Bud, that you've brought up, not with one single solution, but with a whole range of approaches.
Excellent. Well, Alyn, we're getting close to the end. So do you have a few minutes? Can you go over a little bit, or? Oh, great. Okay,
Certainly.
quickly, we'll go to David. David, go right ahead.
Okay. So, Alyn, the organization Gary Davis founded, World Service Authority, is pleased to be working with the World Federalist Movement and Citizens for Global Solutions on law, not war, which I know is mostly focused on the ICJ. So I've got one quick announcement and then a question pertaining to that. There's the advocacy and program officer of the Secretary for the International Criminal Court, Yasmina Gorchain, is going to be at our World Court of Human Rights Coalition meeting next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And I'd love for anyone on this call to come and visit with us. She's going to be talking about coalition building and using civil society advocacy to make change in the world. So that, and I'll put here in the chat the link to that. So my question is, besides the ICJ, which is what law, not war is mostly focused on, what do you see for the use of the ICC and an eventual creation of a World Court of Human Rights as mechanisms for peace and ending the nuclear threat?
Yeah, thanks, David. So these go hand in hand. The International Court of Justice is working very much on state responsibility. That's what it was set up to do. The International Criminal Court is looking at individual responsibility. And these go hand in hand. They're very, very important. And they're very, very complementary. Of course, they're not the only judicial mechanisms that we need. We need other ones as well. And so you've mentioned one, which is a proposal, an International Court of Human Rights. There's also a proposal for an International Anti-Corruption Court. There's also a proposal for an International Environment Court. And all of these would help to build the judicial aspect of global governance, which is so important. And for me, which is why I'm with the World Federalist Movement, global governance is so important if we're going to be able to work on these issues effectively. And the judicial wing of that is so important. So too are the political wings, and so too is the democratic wing. And for example, the proposal of having a UN Parliamentary Assembly is really important, so that individuals can have direct input, into the UN and feel that, hey, this is our body. At the moment, most people don't think of the UN as our body. They think of it as the government's body, and a UN Parliamentary Assembly would help do that. So there are these judicial mechanisms. There are some other ones around at the moment that are also very good. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, for example, is a really good international tribunal that's doing a lot. There are also some regional ones. So you have the European Court of Human Rights. You've got like a Central American court. So the regional ones are also very important. Yeah, I know it's sort of like it's getting a bit complicated. So many courts, but it's just that one court can't do everything. And we know that in our own countries, there are different variations of courts and relationships between them. We're doing the same. Keep it as simple as possible, but you can't just do it as one. It will be a mix of these courts, and they'll all have a role to play.
Excellent. Well, now quickly go to Peter. Peter, go right ahead.
Alyn, folks, I've worked with Alyn before. We pulled off a coup together across the ocean a couple of years ago when Putin and Biden met in Vienna, and it was so much fun, and it was amazing to see what a little bit of international cooperation could do. Alyn, I've said this to you personally, but I'll say it right here. You are absolutely incredible. Your breadth of knowledge, your fire, your determination is just absolutely unstoppable. I only wish that we could mend the fences between you and the folks in ICANN and get everybody working together. One of the huge weaknesses of the nuclear disarmament movement or the nuclear abolition movement is that we are too many little groups not pulling together, but all pulling in their own slightly different directions and not constituting the huge force that we would be if we pulled together. So that's my little homily. And thank you, Alyn. I want to also plug a major international forum that's going on this Saturday that most of you, which is a fault of our weak publicity, have not heard about. It's in the chat. It's called Building a World Without Nuclear Weapons, an urgent imperative. And it features, amongst other things, 3 fabulous speakers. Archbishop John Wester of Santa Fe, the most outspoken Catholic prelate in America by far on the need to eliminate nuclear weapons. Dr. Ira Helfand, who you all know, has been working at this for 20 years. And Marie Dennis, who directs the Pax Christi International Nonviolence Initiative. And the 3 of them are the principal speakers. The whole goal of this thing is to get people to act just in the way that Alyn talked. We are going to present a small piece, a number of actions that at least people can do, at least everybody can do one of, and many can do several of them. And we're asking, I'm going to ask all of you to publicize the daylights out of it at this last minute. Of course, it's because it's only on Saturday, so it's 3 days away. To publicize the daylights out of it so we get everybody to register. Even if they can't attend in real time, they will get the access to the recording within a day. and they will get delivered to their email box our recommendations for action.
Excellent, Peter. That's great. Quickly, we're going to go to Rebecca for 2 seconds. Rebecca, go right ahead. Thanks, Peter. Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me without too much background noise, and apologies as I have to jump for another meeting. And there's far too much to respond to and comment on in this rich conversation to cover it in a quick intervention, but I'll do my best to respond to a couple points. By way of introduction, I'm the Executive Director of Citizens for Global Solutions, which is the member organization based in the United States of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy. So thank you very much to Alyn for this wonderful overview of some of our joint projects and a whole lot more rich background on why we exist. I'll just step in very quickly to Bud's question. I think Alyn answered this to some degree. There is a vocabulary issue. There are not enough words to describe the things that people want to change in the world. And so my organization was actually founded as the World Federalist Association in 1947, the same year as Alyn's. And I always goad him that it was a few months earlier that the US organization was founded than the global. And we've changed our name over the years because of precisely this confusion. And there's nothing to do with the Federalist Society in the United States. The notion of Democratic World Federation, as we now capitulate it in terms of the verbiage, is that national sovereignty is not forfeit if you look towards global governance. And so you're able to have at the national, the regional, and the global levels governance structures. And this is federalism in its technical, accurate term, not a politicized meaning of the word. We are a nonpartisan organization. To some of Alyn's points, however, a judicial capture is not a partisan issue, and in our country or any other. I would add to Alyn's comments maybe a little bit about I think there's a rich room actually for exploration beyond this conversation about the difference between populists and autocrats and authoritarians that control the system directly and those that make use of the system for their own gains. And here it's wonderful to see the judicial system at work in the multiple cases involving the former president of the United States. However, we also see actually that in some instances, that notoriety is working in his favor. So there's more to the issue than that. I think Alyn very well stated the interaction between the international court system, including the ICC, the ICJ, and future international courts such as International Anti-Corruption Court or World Court of Human Rights, as well as the regional systems. One thing that's often overlooked in these conversations is their interplay with domestic systems as well. And there's such a thing called reverse or positive complementarity. So for example, states that do not necessarily have the capacity to go after the bad guys, and that can be individuals or that can be corporations, often work with institutions like the ICC or the ICJ to evolve their systems. And so there is an evolution of growth process at the national level as well that should not be ignored. In the United States, we're very used to a very complicated federalized court system with both state and federal courts. And so this should be no different. And to David's excellent work promoting the World Court of Human Rights, there are only 3 regional courts that focus on human rights issues, and they have different jurisdiction than anything else. So if you can't rely on your national system, and if you can't rely on one of those 3, you're out of luck, because that's not the ICC or the ICJ's jurisdiction. And my rare point of, I very rarely disagree with Alyn, and you'll forgive me if I look like his PR team with all the plugs in the chat. But as the former director of international law and human rights at Parliamentarians for Global Action, there was a balance between those parliamentarians or legislators that want to be prominent and want to be featured. And in some cases, it actually giving them some cover in opposition, and those who wanted to work behind the scenes and grease the wheels and in much more acute and sensitive ways. So with that, I'm so sorry that I have to jump, but thank you so much for this wonderful and rich talk.
Oh,
looking forward to seeing everyone next time.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Alyn, real quick, anything to say, or can we go to Glenn?
I just thought I put in the chat both the link to the new mega website, Mobilizing Earth Government Alliance, because in there we have some of those proposals I was talking about for like the anti-corruption court and environment court, etc., are there on that website, so you can find more about them. And again, it's a very inclusive coalition. Responding to Peter's, I totally agree with Peter's ideas. We need to be respectful of different proposals. You know, we may think our one is the best, someone else will think their one is the best. The idea of working together is we don't have to agree on which is the best. We can work on the one we're most interested in, someone else can work on the one they're interested in, and we can just help provide a platform that we can cooperate and share things together. And MEGA's doing that. And in the nuclear weapons area, Abolition 2000 is the global inclusive network for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And so all different ideas and proposals and methods for advancing nuclear disarmament, whether it's regional nuclear weapon-free zones, no first use, a global convention, they're all there for Abolition 2000 and all welcome. And the annual meeting is on February 2nd and 3rd, and everyone's welcome to come.
Excellent. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Glenn, you're the last. Can you
Thank
really
you.
super fast?
Yeah,
Thanks.
yes. Yeah, a few minutes back, somebody was talking about the oppression of autocrats who oppress us from the top down. We need to take the lesson from Hans Christian Andersen's story about the emperor has no clothes. We need to debunk the notion that those autocrats have the power. We need to debunk the notion that they are populists. They're not populists. They're not on our side. They're oppressing us. They are elitists. And what we need to do is empower people to call bullshit on their stuff and to rewrite the script of what the issues are really about. It's about empowering people. And let's not let those autocrats oppress us, and let's not let the news media tell us that those people are populists. They're not on our side. They're oppressing us, and we can fight back.
Well, thank you. I agree with that. I just wanted to end up with another forward-thinking vision. And this is one of the things that inspired me to get involved in world federalism. And that was the notion that Buckminster Fuller put forward of us living on spaceship Earth. And to me, that was so apt. You know, the idea that here we are, we share this one planet together, and we have to work together on it. And the idea of it being like a spaceship gives a little bit more of a way of thinking about it. You know, on a spaceship, you wouldn't divide it up into a whole lot of different cabins, and each cabin then built up weapons to protect themselves against the other cabin. You know, they wouldn't pollute, you know, the water supply that's on your spaceship, because you know that water supply has to keep people alive for however long the spaceship's going to be going. To me, that's a really nice conceptual framework, spaceship Earth. And that's one that's sort of like also given ideas of world federalism. It's not, because some of the people who fear world federalism think it's an oppressive thing, you know, like a government from above. When it's not, it's about a better way of managing our common home. And so that's why I use that as an image to help explain it to people who might have got sort of negative feelings about global governance or world federation, and oh, that could be an oppressive power. It's not. It's better management of our Earth and ourselves and our lives.
That's a great way to put it. For a lot of people can conceptualize that way. And this has been so, so rich, Alyn. We appreciate so much what you are doing and what you have done. And thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And now quickly we'll go to Arthur. Arthur, take it away.
That was so incredibly enlightening and such an incredible talk. I really appreciate you and look forward to working with you more in the future. I do want to share, while we're on this key issue, a very important resource for everybody. And I'm going to just briefly share my screen to do that. And that is that we're working on a movie, promoting a movie as the Impact Producers, called Television Event. And this is a movie about a movie, The Day After, and the incredible impact it had in helping the world step back from the brink of the war of nuclear war in 1983. And we held a grand reunion of all of the key players who made The Day After, including Nicholas Meyer, the Star Trek director, and others. And there's a lot of news coverage of it. You'll see many of you remember that incredible look at what nuclear war would actually be like and how it helped turn the world around, because it did give us a vivid example. You mentioned young people don't even know why they have to worry about nuclear war. So please do take a look at the site, theworldismycountry.com/nuclear. Play the little videos here of all the important news about it. We have that film now. We're getting it on PBS stations across the country. Join us in getting even more stations to sign up for it so we can get this out across the country. So do take a look at television event on our page, theworldismycountry.com/nuclear. Okay, well, there's so much we could talk about. We could go for hours. Thank you so much, Alyn. Let's set a time when we can chat a little more about ways we can cooperate and carry on the important work that we're both engaged in, and we're all engaged in. As you mentioned, it is a group effort, but it takes key people like you to help keep this group effort moving. So thank you. And thank you, everybody. And so that's it for this week. Come back next week and every week for another episode of the People Powered Planet Podcast.
World citizen, lift up your voices. Oh, you know we got something to say. All we need is the same directions, heading in one way.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video.